Picture this. The year is 1506. A 63-year-old man in white robes sits atop a warhorse, his papal tiara gleaming in the Italian sun. Around him, thousands of soldiers march in formation, their armor clanking with each step. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood fantasy film. This is real history. This is Pope Julius II, and he's leading an army to war. Most people think of the Pope as a peaceful spiritual leader, someone who preaches forgiveness and turns the other cheek. But what if I told you that one Pope literally grabbed a sword, mounted a horse, and charged into battle like a medieval warlord? What if I told you that this same Pope nearly single-handedly changed the face of Renaissance Italy through sheer military might? Today, we're diving into one of history's most shocking papal stories, the tale of Julius II, known to his enemies as the Warrior Pope and the Fearsome Pope. This is a man who transformed the papacy from a spiritual office into a military powerhouse, who personally led sieges, who made and broke alliances with the most powerful rulers in Europe, and who left behind a legacy that would forever change how we think about the relationship between church and state. But how does a man sworn to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ end up becoming one of the most feared military commanders of his age? How does someone who represents peace on earth become a master of war? The answer lies in the chaotic, violent, and politically explosive world of Renaissance Italy, a world where survival meant embracing power, and power meant embracing war. Buckle up, because this story will shatter everything you thought you knew about papal history. This is the incredible true story of the Pope who went to war. To understand how Julius II became a warrior, we need to step back into the world of early 16th century Italy, a world that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Italy in 1500 wasn't the unified country we know today. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing city-states, duchies, and territories, each fighting for survival and supremacy. Venice controlled the northeast with its mighty naval empire. Florence dominated Tuscany under the iron grip of the Medici family. Naples was controlled by Spain, while France had its eyes set on conquering northern Italy. And right in the center of this chaos sat the Papal States, a collection of territories stretching across central Italy that the Pope ruled not just as a spiritual leader, but as a temporal prince. The papacy had been through hell in the centuries leading up to Julius's reign. The Great Western Schism had seen multiple competing popes tear the church apart. The papal court had been driven from Rome to Avignon, making the Pope look like a puppet of the French king. Corruption was rampant, with some popes openly acknowledging their illegitimate children and using church wealth to fund lavish lifestyles. But perhaps most dangerously, the Papal States themselves were crumbling. Local strongmen called condottieri, essentially Renaissance warlords, had carved up papal territory into their own personal fiefdoms. These weren't just bandits. They were sophisticated military entrepreneurs who sold their services to the highest bidder and treated papal land like their personal property. When Giuliano della Rovere became Pope Julius II in 1503, he inherited this nightmare scenario. The papal treasury was nearly empty. Papal authority was a joke among European powers, and most humiliatingly, the Pope couldn't even control his own territories. But Julius wasn't your typical Pope. Born into a noble family from Liguria, he had spent decades navigating the brutal world of Renaissance politics before taking the papal throne. He had served as a cardinal under multiple popes, had been forced into exile, and had personally witnessed how weakness invited destruction in this unforgiving world. Julius understood something that many of his predecessors had forgotten. In Renaissance Italy, respect came from strength, and strength came from military power. Julius II didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a warrior pope. His transformation into a military commander was driven by a series of escalating crises that left him with no choice but to fight or watch the papacy crumble into irrelevance. The first major challenge came from the condottieri, who had essentially stolen papal territory. The most dangerous of these was Cesare Borgia, son of the previous Pope Alexander VI. Cesare had used his father's papal connections to carve out a personal empire in central Italy, seizing towns that rightfully belonged to the Church. When Alexander died and Julius took power, Cesare still controlled vast swaths of papal territory. Julius's response was swift and decisive. Rather than negotiate or compromise, he immediately began assembling military forces to reclaim what was rightfully the Church's. But this wasn't just about territory. It was about establishing a principle that would define his entire papacy. The Pope would bow to no earthly power. The second crisis came from foreign interference. France, under King Louis XII, had invaded northern Italy and was making moves to control papal policy through military pressure. At the same time, Venice was expanding its territory into areas that Julius considered papal domain. The Pope found himself surrounded by enemies who viewed him as weak and the papal states as easy pickings. Most popes throughout history would have turned to diplomacy, prayer, or compromise. Julius chose war. His decision wasn't made lightly. Julius understood that by taking up arms, he was fundamentally changing what it meant to be pope. He was transforming the spiritual leader of millions of Catholics into a temporal warlord. But he also understood something else. In a world where only the strong survived, a weak pope was a dead pope. The preparations were methodical and extensive. Julius began by reforming papal finances, cutting unnecessary expenses, and redirecting church resources toward military purposes. He negotiated alliances with various Italian states and foreign powers, playing the complex game of Renaissance diplomacy with masterful skill. But most importantly, Julius made a personal commitment that would shock the Christian world. He would personally lead his armies into battle. In 1506, Pope Julius II did something unprecedented in papal history. He personally took command of an army and marched to war. His first target was the city of Perugia, which had fallen under the control of the Baglioni family, local strongmen who had been defying papal authority for years. The sight must have been extraordinary. The Pope, dressed in armor beneath his papal robes, riding at the head of a professional army. Contemporary accounts describe Julius as a formidable figure on horseback, his white beard flowing beneath a steel helmet, his eyes burning with determination. This wasn't a ceremonial appearance. Julius was there to fight. The siege of Perugia showcased Julius's strategic brilliance. Rather than immediately assault the city's walls, he combined military pressure with psychological warfare. The mere sight of the Pope personally leading an army sent shockwaves throughout Italy. Here was concrete proof that the papacy had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a spiritual office that could be pushed around by local strongmen. The Baglioni family, faced with the unprecedented sight of an armed pope at their gates, chose surrender over destruction. Perugia opened its gates without a fight, and Julius entered the city in triumph. But this was just the beginning. Julius's next target was Bologna, a much more formidable opponent. The city was controlled by Giovanni Bentivoglio, a powerful condottiere who had turned Bologna into his personal kingdom. Unlike Perugia, Bologna was prepared to fight. The campaign for Bologna would test every aspect of Julius's military leadership. He had to coordinate complex siege operations, manage supply lines, and maintain the morale of his troops during a grueling winter campaign. Contemporary accounts describe the Pope personally inspecting fortifications, conferring with his generals, and even coming under enemy fire during reconnaissance missions. But Julius's greatest weapon wasn't military strategy. It was his unprecedented personal presence on the battlefield. Medieval and Renaissance warfare was deeply psychological. Soldiers fought harder for leaders they could see and respect, and no sight was more inspiring to papal troops than their spiritual father sharing their dangers and hardships. The siege of Bologna lasted months, with Julius demonstrating remarkable persistence and tactical flexibility. When direct assault failed, he implemented a careful blockade. When negotiations stalled, he applied military pressure. Throughout it all, he remained personally present, sharing the risks and privations of his soldiers. Finally, in 1507, Bologna surrendered. Julius entered the city in a magnificent triumph that announced to all of Europe that the papacy had returned as a major political and military power. Julius II's military campaigns didn't end with Bologna. Over the following years, he would continue to wage war across Italy, personally leading armies against Venice, France, and various Italian states. His most famous military achievement came during the War of the League of Cambrai, where he successfully played European powers against each other while steadily expanding papal territory. But perhaps his most audacious military action came in 1511, when the 68-year-old Pope personally participated in the siege of Mirandola during one of the coldest winters in memory. Contemporary accounts describe Julius climbing siege ladders and personally directing artillery fire, his white beard covered with frost, his papal robes dirty with mud and gunpowder. The transformation was complete. Julius had successfully converted the papacy from a weak spiritual office into one of Italy's major military powers. The papal states were not only restored, but expanded. Papal authority was no longer questioned by local strongmen, and the Pope himself was now recognized as one of Europe's most formidable political leaders. But Julius's legacy extends far beyond military conquest. His successful assertion of papal temporal power fundamentally changed the relationship between the Church and European politics. Future popes would never again be dismissed as irrelevant spiritual figures. They were now recognized as serious political players who demanded respect and could back up their demands with force. Julius also understood that military power was only one component of lasting influence. During his reign, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to decorate the Vatican apartments. He laid the cornerstone for the new St. Peter's Basilica. His patronage of Renaissance art and architecture was directly funded by the wealth and stability his military campaigns had secured. However, Julius's warrior papacy also created lasting problems for the Church. His military activities scandalized many Christians who believed the Pope should embody peace and humility. The massive expenses of his wars and building projects contributed to the financial pressures that would later drive the Church to sell indulgences, the practice that would ultimately provoke Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation. When Julius died in 1513, he left behind a papacy that was militarily powerful, financially stable, and politically influential. But he also left behind fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual leadership that continue to resonate today. The story of Julius II forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, leadership, and the relationship between ideals and reality. In a world of violence and chaos, was Julius's embrace of military power a necessary adaptation for survival, or a betrayal of Christian principles? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Julius's story is how one man's willingness to completely reimagine his role changed the course of history. The Pope who went to war didn't just save the papacy, he created a new model of leadership that would influence European politics for centuries to come. In the end, Julius II proves that sometimes the most shocking transformations come from the most unexpected places. The man who was supposed to represent peace on earth became one of history's most effective warriors, and in doing so, he ensured that his office would never again be dismissed or ignored. The warrior Pope had spoken, and the world had listened. Thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe for more contents like this.